Today we're going to talk about opposites and absolute value. The opposite of an integer is the opposite sign. So the opposite of a positive number is its negative number, and vice versa. The opposite of a negative number is its positive. So take, for example, the opposite of 3. The opposite of 3 is negative 3. The opposite of negative 3 is 3. Now take a look at this information here. Positive numbers, as we know, are graphed to the right or above 0 on a number line. Negative numbers are graphed to the left or below 0 on a number line. 0 is neither negative nor positive, so it doesn't have an opposite. It's its own opposite, if you want to think of it that way. Take a look at some examples. So the opposite of negative 5. You can see on a number line that the opposite of a number is the same distance from 0. It's just going the other direction. So the opposite of negative 5 is 5. The opposite of negative 5 would be 5. Here's another method to think of it. It uses a negative symbol. The opposite of a negative symbol is a positive symbol. Here's another example. This one is a tricky one. Look at this. Find the opposite of the opposite of 4. Well, the opposite of 4 would be negative 4. And the opposite of negative 4 would be 4. So this is kind of tricky here. The opposite of the number is the number itself. If you're ever asked to find the opposite of 4, it's going to be 4. The opposite of negative 3 will be negative 3. It's like reverting back to the original. And once you understand this, you can find the opposite of the opposite of the opposite of the opposite. The opposite is simply changing the sign. So try a couple. Make sure you understand this. Let me give you a couple of examples here. Why don't you try to find the opposite of negative 4, then try to find the opposite of 3, then find the opposite of 0. Try these 3. Just find the opposite. Pause the video and we'll go over them in a few seconds. So, the opposite of negative 4 is simply 4. The opposite of 3 is simply negative 3. What did you do about this? Right. The opposite of 0 is 0. There is no negative 0. No such thing. All right, let's talk about a more complicated concept, and that is absolute value. A lot of kids think absolute value is the same thing as the opposite, but it isn't. Absolute value, take a look at the definition. I want you to write down this definition on your note sheet or in your journals and try to memorize it. The absolute value of a number is the distance between the number and 0. Absolute value is the distance from 0. Absolute value can be written with these little symbols. Looks like a line in front and behind of the number. And this can be read as the absolute value of 4. The absolute value of 4 simply means how many spaces is 4 from 0. So when you look at 4 from 0, it's 4 spaces. So the absolute value of 4 is 4. Look at this example. Make sure you write these down. The absolute value of negative 4 is also 4. See, this is simply asking how far is negative 4 away from 0. We'll take a look at the number line. Negative 4 is 1, 2, 3, 4 spaces from 0. We don't use negatives for distance from 0. Here's something important to note. It's very useful. Absolute value is never negative. The distance from 0 is never going to be represented with a negative number. So this is different from opposite. The opposite of a positive is a negative. But the absolute value of a positive is a positive. And the absolute value of a negative is still going to be a positive. So the absolute value of negative 4 or the absolute value of 4 is still going to be 4. here's that note I was trying to tell you here. Since distance cannot be negative, the absolute value of a number is always positive. The absolute value of 0 is 0, of course, because the distance between 0 and 0 is nothing. Let's take a look at some examples. Write these down. Evaluate the absolute value of negative 7. This is read as the absolute value of negative 7. It's asking us how many spaces is negative 7 away from 0. And that's simply 7. The absolute value of any number is always positive. If I were asked to find the absolute value of 8, that would be 8. That's different from opposite. The opposite of 8 is negative 8. If I asked you to find the opposite of 8, that would be negative 8. But the absolute value of 8 is 8. Because absolute value is the distance from 0. Okay, they get a little more complicated, so make sure you're writing this down. This is asking us to evaluate a sentence with absolute values. First, you find the absolute value. Kind of treat them like parentheses when you're finding order of operations, when you're using order of operations. You want to evaluate the absolute value first. Then do any adding or subtracting and so on. So first I find the absolute value of 5. That's simply 5. Then I find the absolute value of negative 6. That's simply 6. And then I'm going to add or subtract whatever the operation is. Do the operations at the end after you find absolute value. So that's going to be 11. Look at this one. Let's try another one. The absolute value of negative 7 is 7. And the absolute value of 3 is 3. It's asking me to subtract them. So that answer is 4. So I can read this as the absolute value of negative 7 minus the absolute value of 3. And that's the same thing as 7 minus 3, which is 4. Why don't you try a couple? Oh, actually, one more real-life example for you. In fact, let's do this tomorrow in class. I want you to try a couple of absolute value problems. Why don't you try letter C and do letter G and letter H for now, and then pause the video, unpause when you're finished, and we'll go over them. All right, let's look at how you did with operating with absolute value. Well, first of all, pretty simple. This is asking us to find the absolute value of 14, and that is simply 14. Remember, absolute value is different than opposite. Absolute value is what again? Say it to yourself. It's the distance from 0. It's just the distance from this number to 0. So that's 14, always positive. Let's check this one. The absolute value of negative 12 is 12, plus the absolute value of 7 is 7. So when I add those together, that gives me 19. Let's check this one. The absolute value of 11 is 11, minus the absolute value of negative 9 is 9, and 11 minus 9 is 2. We will practice some more with absolute value. We'll look at some more real-life examples and operating with absolute value tomorrow. See you then.